started out actually on a skimboard. My brother and I were living in Cape May, New Jersey at the time, which was an ideal place to skimboard because they had flat, hard-packed beaches. And Popular Mechanics had an article about skimboards. And it was basically, we got a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, marine plywood, cut it out in a circle, beveled the edges, and started skimboarding. And it wasn't long after that before a friend of mine said, hey, you ought to try surfing. And so it was Turco's Sporting Products in Wildwood, New Jersey, about a Royal Hawaiian pop-out board, classic. 9 foot, it delaminated the first summer I had it. My father was a Presbyterian minister in Cape May for 11 years. When I was 16 in 1966, he took the church in Ocean City, Maryland, again, a beach resort, because he knew it. I knew what a beach resort ministry was like. And I, at the time, was living in a house that was 2 blocks away from Spider Surf Shop, inside of my kitchen window. And that winter, I took to hanging out at Spider Surf Shop, and he said, hey, would you like to patch some boards for me? So I wound up patching all of his rental boards for the summer crowd. That was 1967, the Weber Performer. It was a long board, but it had a big, wide scoop nose with a hatchet fin when they started those. And at the time, David Hartman and Skill Johnson were riding surfboards for Spider. Bill Helmuth and others were riding, and John Phillips were riding for Eastern Surfer, the Hobie shop, sort of the competing 2 shops in the area. And Spider had brought some kids up from Riviera Beach, Florida, a kid named Jay Evilsizer and another guy. And Jay Evilsizer wound up staying in the Ocean City area. But yeah, the Spider surf team, I was sort of a Johnny-come-lately to it. I was hanging around enough, they said, well, let's put him on the team. In fact, one of the pictures that we had taken at the Eastern Surfing, or not the Eastern, the Middle Atlantic Surfing Contest run by the JCs. I'm holding trophies, but those trophies are all Gary Ferguson's. So I had my little moment of claim to fame. It was kind of cool. The ego, had a student years later see that picture in a newspaper when they were advertising a get-together with Skill Johnson. And she says, gee, Mr. Stern, you used to have a good body. I went, thanks, I think. So the old days are the fun days. Gunzelman was still, had a shop, a Jacobs shop, down underneath the Atlantic Hotel. He was selling the Jacobs 422 model, and that was whenever the Johnson brothers were riding for Gunzelman. But it was, when you say riding for, it's just a matter of you get a discount on a surfboard when you get aboard. It wasn't quite the sponsorships they have today. A little more genuine, I'd say. Bob Church's parents owned the Ocean Park Motel. It was right there at 16th and 17th Street. And I'd always go up and sort of hang out with Bob. Jeff Mumford's parents were at the Sandy Hill next door. They had a surf shop under there at one point. I'd like to say that I started surfing Ocean City before the guards started enforcing surfing regulations. I didn't. I got there after the fact. And they all told me about the glory days, whenever you could surf anywhere, anytime. When I first arrived, Spider was still renting boards up at 94th Street, which was nothing but sand. Only Bobby Baker's Carousel was up there. By that time, Bill Wise had had his accident, so I really didn't even know Bill. I knew that George Pittman was still running Eastern Surfer. In the middle of my high school years, when I was hooked up with Gary Ferguson, who rode for the Eastern Surfer, that's when Walt Austin bought the store from George Pittman. George Pittman had moved on to bigger and better things from there. The early days of my surfing there, we really didn't even have surfing beaches. You just couldn't surf before 10 or after 10 or before 5. So we used to, especially in the fall, we would always paddle across the inlet to Assateague. And Skill Johnson had it down to a science where he would actually pack matches in a plastic bag and stick them in the back of his wetsuit. So we'd get over there, we'd find an old tire washed up on the beach, we'd light the tire on fire, and that would keep us warm before the wetsuits would melt, stuff like that. So that sort of kept us warm in the winter months. But yeah, it was pretty restrictive at that point. The Bombora off the shore of Assateague Island I believe it was Gary Ferguson and I and Dave Hartman. And we saw it was breaking out there. We thought we really would like to go out there. Well, wouldn't you know, John Collins shows up in a Boston whaler. And he said, hey, John, would you, he wasn't surfing at the time. He was just riding around in his boat. And we said, would you take us out there? He says, yeah, I'll take you out, but I can't bring you back. So he said, what the heck? You know, we were young, foolish, didn't know any better. So he drove us out to the Bombora, and it's the weirdest feeling anywhere. You know, you're taking off and there's no shore. And you start looking for things in the water, and you know that you've got to paddle all the way back to Assateague Island. But when you're young and you're foolish and you're in condition, you don't really think about that. And we got some very nice waves out there and then paddled all the way back to Assateague Island. My early years in Ocean City, you know, I was just a grommet, like so many others, enjoying what I could enjoy. Looking forward to the surf trips to Cape Hatteras. Part of surfing really is the adventure of the surf trip, something I've always enjoyed. My first real surf trip was to Puerto Rico in the late 60s, right after I graduated from high school. I worked my first summer job at a movie theater, getting $1 an hour, $21 a week, so I could afford the plane ticket to Puerto Rico that Christmas. The plane ticket then was $132 round trip. Bargain days, Eastern Airlines. Gary and I and David had a really great time the first year, and the next year I decided I wanted to go again. David and I spent the first couple of days at the Mayaguez Hilton because his parents went down, had rented the car for us. And the next week we stayed in the car. It was not comfortable, but it certainly was a chance to surf full time at Maria's down near Domes. The first year we were at Punta Higuera, which was David's father, who was working for the agriculture department, had actually gotten funding for Antonio to build his whole resort in Puerto Rico. So that's sort of where we found that connection. The biggest travel event of my life was the trip I took to El Salvador the year after David Hartman came back from there, saying he had had such a good time and really good waves. So my new wife of only a year, I said, let's go to Central America. And we drove 10,000 miles to Central America and back. Didn't really surf many places along the way. Did surf in Port Isabel near Brownsville, Texas. Not much in the way of waves there, all slop. Then drove down the isthmus of Central America, cut across at Veracruz to the west coast, and then wound up in El Salvador, staying at the same, we called it Gringo Gardens. It was where John Parton and a number of other Floridians, John Parton was at Fox Surfboards, were camped out, and also Bob Rotherham and Eric Penny had just done an article in Surfer magazine about Petacaucau, which was up in Mexico. A really nice wave spot that they had found on their travels. El Salvador was much more cosmopolitan. It was right there in town, a point that would eventually become Rocky Point. Bob Rotherham married a local girl and built himself a restaurant right there in the bay at La Libertad. In the meantime, Dave Hartman went back the next year and bought himself a whole point down near San Miguel, further south. We called it Playa El Cuco. Very nice place. He's only been back, I think, twice since then. Had somebody build a well on the property for him, but that was about it. As far as we know, he still owns it. Nothing beats a day in the water, especially if it's warm water. But yes, it relieves a host of tensions. It's a way to get away. It's an escape. Classic example of my risking everything for a surfing session. I left school late on Saturday, about 5:30, and I knew there was only a good hour and a half of sunlight still left. Got home, my wife had made a full chicken dinner, you know, the roasted chicken and everything else, and I came in and said, hi, goodbye, and she goes, what? I spent all this time getting the chicken ready and you're going out the door for a 10-minute surf session? I said, hey, every little bit counts. Even when I was in high school, my mother used to, it's in the oven, it'd be dried out, but you know, it was food. And when you come out of a surf session, everybody should know, it doesn't matter the quality of the food, so you get food in your stomach.